Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Chairman, for joining us today. Let me share a completely opposing point of view from that of the Senator from New York, which will not be a shock to members of this committee. I can't help but observe what strikes me as a very obvious paradox here, and that is the financial and economic crisis is over. It's been over for years, at least 6 or 7 years, and yet we still maintain crisis-level interest rates. We've got no wave of defaults or massive bankruptcies going on. We have unemployment has gone from 10% to sub 6%. GDP growth has been weak. I think that's easily explained by the avalanche of new regulations, certainly not monetary policy, but it's been positive for years. Consumer sentiment is relatively high. The FOMC in January described the economic recovery as solid. Walmart, interestingly, has made an announcement that suggests we might even be approaching Nehru. The crisis has been over for a long time. And it's not as though there's no price to be paid by having this unbelievably accommodative policy. Most immediately, I see the problem incurred by my constituents who may have spent a lifetime working hard, sacrificing, saving, foregoing a vacation they might have taken, foregoing a splurge here and there, so that they could save for their retirement and buy a CD, have some money on deposit at a bank, and use that to supplement a modest pension or Social Security payments. Of course, their reward now is they get nothing, zero. That's what they earn on their savings year after year. Meanwhile, of course, we have all the risks associated with this. The risk of bubbles forming. I would argue the fixed income markets probably are a huge bubble at the moment. We have the inhibition of price discovery in financial sector. We facilitate excessive deficits because they look so manageable with zero interest rate environment. Credit is rationed. And what are the benefits of this? The benefits are, at best, a timing shift in economic activity. At best, we're moving economic activity that would otherwise occur in the future closer to the present. As we all know, if artificially low interest rates led to strong economic growth, then everyone around the world would have zero interest rates and everything would be booming, and that's not the case. So, Madam Chairman, I know you and I disagree on this, but I would just suggest the crisis is clearly long over. I think the time for normalization is well overdue. I hope we get there soon, but I did want to ask you a specific question that's related, and that is, you've said repeatedly that the goal of price stability is 2% inflation. Well, certainly there's a congressional mandate on price stability, but when the Fed decides that it's acceptable, and in fact that is met by savers losing 2% of their purchasing power annually, and let me put that a different way, that means a 30-year-old woman who's saving, by the time she retires, that what she has saved at that point will have lost half of its value. Half of it's gone. How's that consistent with price stability?
Well, the Federal Reserve is the FOMC in carrying out Congress's mandate, really does have to define how we understand price stability operationally. 2% inflation is an inflation rate that we chose largely for two reasons. First of all, it's well known that price indices that we look at contain upward biases, in part because their failure to adequately capture the benefits of new goods and quality improvement. So there are hard to measure, but nevertheless upward biases in price indices. And second of all, because deflation is so dangerous, and because an environment of very low inflation and one of comparably extremely low interest rates makes it difficult for monetary policy to respond to adverse shocks, we've decided that in order to avoid damaging episodes of deflation, it's wise to have a small buffer that gives greater room for monetary policy to operate.
Thank you. I'm going to run out of time here, so I just want to get to my second question. I would just urge you to consider the impact of savers losing their purchasing power. Historically, of course, we have changed the level of accommodation through open market activities. typically buying and selling securities, to have corresponding changes in the level of cash. You've suggested, if I understand you correctly, that in the process of normalizing, assuming we will get to that process, you intend to achieve that principally by changing the target level of the Fed funds rate.
Yes.
And you will do that by increasing the interest on excess reserves.
Correct.
And my question is, since that means over time, in a normalizing environment, the transfer of tens of billions of dollars from what would go to the taxpayers to big money center banks, why are you doing that instead of simply selling the bonds, which is a more conventional way to operate in the open market operation?
Well, remember that, first of all, we will be paying banks rates that are comparable to those that they can earn in the marketplace, so those payments don't involve subsidies to banks. And in addition, remember that we have, in expanding our provision of reserves, we have acquired longer-term assets on the asset side of our balance sheet, and the spread above what we've been paying in terms of interest on excess reserves is quite large. So although that will diminish over time as monetary policy is normalized, the expansion of our balance sheet, even though we are, even at present, paying 25 basis points interest on reserves, we've had record transfers to the Treasury, close to $100 billion this past year and $500 billion since 2009. So there have been large transfers associated with that policy.
But that situation is likely to reverse if we get into a normalization mode.
So it is likely that our transfers to our remittances to the Treasury will decline as short-term rates rise. We nevertheless expect the remittances to remain positive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.